She was 37 years old, and she owned nothing but a carpet bag, a coin purse with $4.60 inside, and the clothes on her back when she walked into the town of Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1887. The man who had put her on the road was her late husband's brother, Gareth Holt, who had spent 6 weeks after the funeral finding every legal instrument that would allow him to strip the ironworks from her hands. And he had found them all, one by one, like a man picking stones from a field, until the land and the building and the tools and the accounts were his, and she was a widow with a carpet bag. She had $4.60. And in the far end of Harlan's Crossing there was an abandoned forge, a cold, soot-blackened shell of a smithy that the town had been trying to sell for 2 years without a single offer. And the mayor practically pressed it into her hands for $4 even, grateful to be rid of the eyesore. Everyone who watched her push open that rusted door shook their head. A woman alone. An empty building. A dead hearth. What could possibly come of it? But inside the cold belly of that forge, packed into the throat of the flue and sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth, something had been waiting. Something that would not merely change her life, but would reach back across a decade of grief and theft and silence and give an entire valley back what had been stolen from it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Voss. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, from a quiet town, an empty room, a life that seems to have gone cold, tell us about it in the comments, because this story was made for you. Nora was born in the summer of 1850 in a small Ohio river town called Greenvale, the second daughter of a man named August Tice, who was the finest blacksmith in 3 counties and perhaps the most patient teacher his craft had ever produced. August Tice believed, with the kind of quiet conviction that requires no argument, that iron was honest. He would say this to his daughters at the dinner table, would say it while he worked the bellows in the dim orange heat of his shop, would say it when Nora came to stand beside him and watch the metal move under his hands like something alive. Iron is honest. You heat it right, and it gives. You cool it too fast, and it tells you so. You ask it for more than it can give, and it breaks clean, and the break shows you exactly where you went wrong. He was not a man who talked much about people, but when he talked about iron, he was talking about people, and Nora understood this even as a girl of 8 or 9. Understood it the way children understand things that are true and large before they have the words to name them. He taught her to work the bellows before she was tall enough to see over the rim of the forge. He taught her to read the color of heated steel, the pale straw of a low temper, the bright cherry of a good working heat, the blinding white orange that meant you had gone too far and must let it rest. He taught her to listen to the hammer and to the metal both, because the sound of a blow well struck is different from the sound of a blow wasted, and your ear will know before your arm does. He wrote nothing down. He believed you carried knowledge in your hands and your eyes and the set of your shoulders, and that if you had truly learned a thing, a book would only be a pale substitute for what was already living inside you. Nora's older sister Marta left for Cincinnati at 17 and married a cloth merchant's son and sent cheerful letters twice a year. Nora stayed. She stayed because the forge was where she was most herself, most settled, most without the particular restlessness that plagued her when she was away from the heat and the iron and the rhythm of the hammer. She stayed because her father was getting older and his eyes were not as sharp and his hands, though still strong, carried a tremor by late afternoon that he would never acknowledge and did not need to, because she was already there, already compensating, already doing the fine work in the hours when his precision had drifted. She stayed because she loved it. This is simple and complete and requires no further explanation. She married at 24, which her mother considered rather late. The man was Edmund Voss, who had come to Greenvale from Pennsylvania to buy agricultural tools and had stayed 3 extra days because he could not stop watching Nora work. He was an accountant for a land trust, a careful, orderly man who kept his ledgers in a clean copperplate hand. He and Nora were not alike in temperament and were deeply alike in character, which is the more durable combination. He loved her without fuss or performance. She loved him with the same directness she brought to everything. Her father died in the winter of 1878, and Nora and Edmund absorbed the Greenvale smithy into their life. They talked about moving west for 3 years before they did it, and when they did it, in the spring of 1883, they did it carefully and well. Harlan's Crossing was a town of about 400 people when the Vosses arrived. growing slowly along a creek that fed into a larger river 20 miles south, supporting 2 cattle operations and a timber claim and a small but ambitious community of homesteaders. It needed a smithy urgently. The previous smith, a man named Aldous Boone, had died of a fever the previous autumn and left behind his forge and tools and an unfinished commission for gate hardware that had been stalling the new schoolhouse's construction for 6 months. Nora looked at Boone's forge, solid, well-positioned, with a good chimney draw, and said yes without hesitation. They were home. She spent 4 years building what her father had built in Greenvale, a forge that was also a quiet center, a place where people came not merely for their tools and horseshoes but to wait, to talk, to bring problems that were not strictly metallurgical and receive the benefit of Nora's attention, which was complete and unhurried. She made the schoolhouse's gate hardware and the hinges on the new church door and the decorative scrollwork on the front of the general store. She trained a boy named Caleb Pruitt to work the bellows and taught him to read a heat, and he was slow to learn but honest about it, which she valued as her father had valued it. She kept the books in Edmund's hand. She was happy in the way that people are happy when they have found the work they were made for and the place where that work is needed. Edmund died in the winter of 1886. It was quick. It was pneumonia, the great indiscriminate thief of that era, and it did not give them enough time to do anything but say what needed to be said, and Nora had always believed, afterward, that they had said it. He was 51. She was 36. She stood at the grave in the frozen ground and felt the cold settle into her in a way that she understood was not only weather. Gareth Holt arrived from Pennsylvania in January of 1887. He was Edmund's younger brother, a man Nora had met 3 times in the course of their marriage, a man of legal precision and personal coldness who had always seemed to her to regard Edmund's choices, the marriage, the West, the smithy, the whole chosen life, with the mild contempt of someone watching another person waste a hand of good cards. He arrived with a lawyer from Cheyenne and a collection of documents that Nora's own attorney, a tired man named Purvis who mostly handled livestock disputes, had not seen before and was not equipped to counter. The documents were legitimate. This was the thing that Nora would turn over in her mind for months afterward, the thing that made it so much worse than simple theft. Edmund, in the early years of their marriage, before they had left Pennsylvania, had signed a family instrument that gave Gareth a claim to any business assets held under the Voss name in the event of Edmund's death without a surviving male heir. The instrument was obscure and had been written by Edmund's father, and Edmund may not have fully understood it, or may have trusted that Gareth would never invoke it against a widow who had built the business with her own hands. He had been wrong. Nora contested it. She spent 2 months and most of their savings on legal counsel, and the second attorney she hired was better but not better than the instrument, which had been drafted with no useful gaps. In April of 1887, the Harlan's Crossing smithy and all its contents passed legally to Gareth Holt, who had no intention of operating it, and every intention of selling it to a buyer he had already identified in Laramie. Nora was permitted to remove her personal items and was given 30 days to vacate. She could have left. Several people told her she should leave. The schoolteacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Allgate, suggested gently that her sister in Cincinnati might welcome her, that there was no shame in starting over somewhere else. The mayor, Horace Fenwick, told her with honest sorrow that he did not see what there was to hold her in Harlan's Crossing once the smithy was gone. Even young Caleb Pruitt, who was 18 and furious on her behalf in the way that only the very young can sustain for long, asked her what she was going to do and seemed to mean, by this, whether she was going to go. She was not going to go. This was not stubbornness, or not only stubbornness. It was the more fundamental thing that her father had tried to explain to her with his talk of iron. The thing about knowing when what looks like a break is actually a new form. The thing about the material telling you where it went wrong and what it needs next. Harlan's Crossing was where she was. It was where Edmund was buried. It was where she had learned to read the particular quality of the afternoon light through a south-facing window, and the sound of the creek in spring, and the names of the people on the street, and the names of their children, and their horses and their worries. She had not come all this way to leave when it got cold. The old Boone forge sat at the east end of town, past the grain store and around a slight bend in the main road, on a lot that had gone to weeds in the years since Aldous Boone's death. It was smaller than the Voss smithy by about a third, with a roof that had developed several ambitions toward collapse and a chimney that the mayor described as structurally uncertain and a hearth that had not been lit in nearly 5 years. The town had been carrying it on the tax rolls at a nominal value for 2 years and had received no serious offers. It was, the mayor admitted without trying to dress it up, essentially worthless as a going concern. Nora stood in the doorway of it on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1887, 2 weeks after she had left the Voss smithy for the last time, and she looked at the dead hearth and the rusted tongs hanging from their hook and the weeds pushing up through the packed earth floor near the east wall, where the roof had let in water, and she felt something that was not hope exactly, but was in the same country as hope, a kind of recognition. The way you recognize a face you have not seen in years. A forge is a forge. Cold is not broken. She paid $4 for it. Mayor Fenwick took the money with visible discomfort and gave her the deed with both hands, as if handing her something fragile. She thanked him, folded the deed into the inside pocket of her coat, and spent the remaining 60 cents on a small bag of coal and a box of matches at the general store. She worked for 2 days cleaning the space before she even attempted the hearth, sweeping, pulling weeds, patching the worst of the roof gaps with timber she pried from a collapsed outbuilding behind the property, moving with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that beginning properly is not a delay but a foundation. On the 3rd day, she examined the chimney flue by kneeling on the hearthstone and looking up into the throat of it with a candle, checking the draw, testing the damper, assessing the mortar between the fire bricks. The damper was stiff but operable. The mortar had cracked in 2 places, but not through. The draw, when she opened the damper and held the candle flame to the opening, was firm and clean. Something stopped her. The candle flame moved, as it should, toward the flue, and then it did something the draw alone should not have caused. It flickered sideways, toward the north wall of the throat, in a way that suggested the airflow was being interrupted somewhere above by an obstacle. Not a bird's nest, which she had expected and looked for. Something else. Something with edges. She stood and went to fetch the tongs from their hook on the wall, checked that their grip was still functional, and returned to the hearth. Kneeling again on the cold stone, she reached up into the throat of the flue with the tongs, their arms fully extended, her shoulder wedged against the firebox opening, and found it almost immediately. A package, wedged into a natural ledge in the stonework about 2 feet up from the damper, wrapped in what she could feel through the tongs was oilcloth, and sealed with something firm. She worked at it carefully, patient as her father had taught her to be with things that required patience, and after about 10 minutes of maneuvering, she worked it loose and drew it out. It was roughly the size of a large book. The oilcloth was aged but had done its work. Beneath it, when she unwrapped the outer layer in the gray autumn light coming through the forge's single window, was a second layer of waxed canvas, and beneath that, preserved with remarkable completeness, was a package of papers. Documents. She counted them as she set them out carefully on the cleanest section of the workbench. 12 sheets in all, of varying sizes and types, some folded and some flat. And resting on top of them, folded once and addressed in a hand she did not recognize to no one in particular, but simply reading, in a careful script, to whoever finds this when it is time, was a letter. She read the letter first. It was dated June of 1879, 8 years prior, and it was written by Aldous Boone himself, the former smith, in a hand that had the deliberate quality of a man who did not write often, but when he did, meant to be understood. Nora read it twice, slowly, and then sat down on the edge of the workbench and read it a 3rd time, because the 3rd time is when you understand not just what a thing says, but what it means. Aldous Boone had written, "I am a man who did one wrong thing in my life, and spent the 14 years since trying to figure out how to make it right, without making it worse. I have decided I cannot do this while I am alive, but I do not want to die with it, and so I am putting it here, in the place where I am most myself, in the hope that someone honest will find it and know what to do." The papers with this letter are the original deeds, the original survey records, and the original water rights documents for the homestead claims of 11 families in the Gallatin Creek drainage, north of this town. They were filed with me for safekeeping in 1873 by those families, who trusted me, and they were stolen from me in the winter of that year by a man named Corbin Jelks, who worked for the Harlan Land Association, and who used their absence to allow the association to challenge and defeat those families' claims and take their land. Jelks gave them back to me the following spring, after the claims were settled against the families, and told me that if I spoke of it, I would be dealt with in the way he dealt with problems. I was afraid. I have been afraid ever since. The families lost their land. Some of them left the territory. Some of them stayed and work as tenant farmers on land they proved up themselves. The deeds in this packet are the originals. I believe, though I am not a lawyer, that they are still valid. I believe the claims can be reopened. I am too old and too tired and too ashamed to do this myself. But someone will find this. I have put it here because iron is honest and the hearth holds heat, and what is real does not disappear just because it goes cold. God forgive me. A. Boone. Nora sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Outside, the creek made its sound. The light through the window was the thin, pale gold of a late autumn afternoon in Wyoming, the kind of light that makes everything look both fragile and precise. She thought about Aldous Boone working this same hearth, putting the package into the throat of the flue with exactly the care she had just used to remove it, hiding the thing that could undo an old wrong because he was not brave enough to use it himself, but was honest enough to preserve it. She thought about 11 families. She thought about land proved up and lost. She thought about the phrase tenant farmers on land they proved up themselves, and she felt something move in her chest that was not unlike the feeling of a cold piece of iron beginning, very slowly, to take heat. She spent the rest of that day with the documents. She laid them out in the order that made organizational sense to her. Edmund had taught her, or she had learned from watching Edmund, to approach a set of papers the way you approach a new material, which is to understand its nature before you ask anything of it. The deeds were original government survey instruments, each bearing a proper land office seal from the territorial office in Cheyenne. The survey records were hand-drawn plats with measurements and boundary markers noted in the standard language of the period, each keyed to a named claimant. The water rights documents were the most complex, being derived from a separate territorial process, but they were complete, and they bore the same official seals, and they were signed in the right places by the right authorities. They were not copies. They were not forgeries. They were the original papers, and they had been waiting in the throat of a cold hearth for 8 years because one frightened man had not known what else to do with them. She wrote down the 11 names from the deeds. She recognized 4 of them from the valley, families she had heard mentioned or seen at the general store, or whose children attended the Harlan's Crossing School. The Pruitt family was among them. She thought about young Caleb, who had worked her bellows and learned to read a heat, and whose father she now recalled had once mentioned, with the brief bitterness of a man who has swallowed a long grief, that his grandfather had farmed the north drainage before the association came through. The Harlan Land Association was not gone. It had reorganized in the early 1880s under new management. The same Corbin Jelks, now older, now presenting himself as a respectable property broker with an office in the county seat at Cartwright. He was known in Harlan's Crossing, known without warmth, known as a man who had a legal claim to large portions of the valley and who exercised that claim without sentiment. 3 of the 11 families' former homesteads were tenanted by their own descendants, paying rent to Jelks's association. The others had been sold, some multiple times, and their current ownership would require careful untangling. Nora re-wrapped the documents in their oilcloth and carried them to her boarding room at Mrs. Allgate's house, where she stored them in her carpet bag with Edmund's photograph. She lay awake that night thinking about what she was about to do, and she was honest with herself about her own situation, because she had been raised to be honest about iron and had found this habit difficult to confine to metallurgy. She was a widow with 60 cents and an unusable forge. She had no social standing she had not built herself and then lost. She had no allies in the legal profession and no money to acquire any. Corbin Jelks had operated for 14 years with these papers missing and presumably believed they were gone for good. The moment she began making inquiries, she would be visible, and visible was dangerous when the person watching you had already arranged one set of land theft and had the resources and the habit to arrange another. She went to see Mayor Fenwick the next morning. She told him she had found documents in the Boone Forge that appeared to be related to the Gallatin Creek land disputes of 1873 and asked what he knew about them. He looked uncomfortable, which was useful information. He suggested she let sleeping dogs lie. She thanked him and left. She went to see Caleb Pruitt next, found him at the stable where he had taken work since the smithy changed hands. She told him carefully and completely what she had found. He stopped walking about halfway through her account and stood still with his hands at his sides, and when she finished he said, "My father's grandfather filed that claim. My father pays rent on it now." She said she knew. He asked what she was going to do. She said she was going to need help. Caleb's uncle in Cartwright, a man named Denton Pruitt, had once worked as a court recorder and knew territorial law better than most. Nora and Caleb rode to Cartwright on a Friday morning in early October, with the oilcloth package and a letter Nora had spent 2 evenings composing, addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, laying out the nature of the documents and the question of whether original deeds, properly filed and sealed, retained their validity when the properties had been acquired through a process predicated on fraudulent absence of those very documents. The letter was good. She knew it was good because her father had taught her that good work announces itself to the person doing it, quietly, in the same way that a well-struck blow on a properly heated piece of steel sounds different from every other blow. There is a rightness to it that is beyond argument. Denton Pruitt read the letter and read the documents and sat at his kitchen table for 20 minutes without speaking, and then said that he knew a man in Cheyenne, a territorial attorney named Hardship, who had been trying to build a case against the Harlan Land Association for 3 years on the basis of witness testimony alone, and who would, upon seeing these documents, likely use language that was unsuitable for present company. The response from Hardship came in 12 days. He rode to Harlan's Crossing himself, which told Nora something about the quality of what she had found. He was a compact, dry, deliberate man in his 40s who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke in the precise, considered way of someone who has learned that careless words are expensive. He spread the documents on Nora's workbench. She had the forge partially cleaned and operational by then, had lit the hearth for the first time and found the draw to be exactly as good as the candle had promised, and he examined them for an hour without comment. Then he said, "These are valid." Then he said, "Jelks is going to fight this with everything he has." Then he said, "He's going to come at whoever brought these forward, and he's going to come hard, and I want you to understand that before we proceed." Nora looked at him across the workbench with the light of the forge behind her and said, "Mr. Hardship, I bought this building for $4. I have 60 cents left. I don't have anything he can take." Hardship almost smiled. He said that was, in its way, the ideal position from which to begin a fight. What followed was not quick and it was not clean, but it was thorough. Hardship filed in Cheyenne in November of 1887. Jelks's attorneys, he had 3 of them, which told you something about the weight of what he was protecting, moved immediately to suppress the documents on procedural grounds, arguing that their chain of custody was broken and their provenance unverifiable. Hardship had anticipated this. He had located, in the weeks since receiving the documents, 2 members of the original 11 families who remembered delivering their papers to Aldous Boone for safekeeping in 1873 and could testify to the specific appearance and content of what they had given him. He had also found, in the Territorial Archives, a cross-reference filing from the Land Office that listed Boone as the custodian of the documents in question, which had been noted in the original filing records and then apparently overlooked or ignored by everyone who had subsequently processed the fraudulent association claims. The suppression motion failed. The case proceeded. Jelks sent a man to Harlan's Crossing in January of 1888, a broad, quiet man who visited the general store and the saloon and asked careful questions about Nora Voss in the way that people ask questions when they are mapping terrain. Mayor Fenwick, who had found his conscience sometime in November when the scope of what Nora had uncovered became clear to him, told this man that Mrs. Voss was a respected member of the community and that the community was watching with interest. Caleb Pruitt, who had the instincts of a young man who has watched someone take something away from his family, told the man nothing useful and watched him until he left town. Nora herself, when the man appeared at the forge door one afternoon, looked up from the gatepost hinge she was shaping and said, without stopping work, "If you've come about the Cheyenne matter, you'll want to speak to Mr. Hardship." She gave him the address. He left. The case was decided in the spring of 1888. The Territorial Court found the original deeds valid and the subsequent association acquisitions of 6 of the 11 properties procedurally void, having been processed during a period when the filing record showed extant custodial documents that should have prevented the claims from being adjudicated. 3 of the 11 properties had been sold and resold in ways that complicated direct reversion, and those families received financial settlements from the association's held assets. The remaining 2 cases involved additional complications that extended the proceedings, but for 6 families, including the Pruitts, the land came back. Corbin Jelks was not arrested. The evidence of his personal role in the original document theft came down to Boone's letter, which was the testimony of a dead man, and the law in 1888 required more than a dead man's letter to convict a living one. But the financial exposure of the association's voided acquisitions, combined with Hardcastle's parallel filing of a fraud complaint with the Territorial Attorney General, was sufficient to dissolve the association entirely. Jelks sold his remaining interests and left the territory. He went to Colorado. No one in Harlan's Crossing missed him. Gareth Holt had nothing to do with any of this and was not touched by any of it. And this was the hardest part for Nora to hold. The part where the justice that had been done was communal and real and not personal. She had not recovered the Voss smithy. She had not recovered Edmund's savings. Gareth still held what he had taken, and the instrument he had used to take it was still valid, and the law still recognized his right to it. She was still a woman with a ruined roof and a forge worth $4 and a community's gratitude, which is warmer than money but does not pay for coal. The community's gratitude, as it turned out, had practical dimensions. The Pruitt family, Caleb's father Daniel and his uncle Denon, and 3 of the Pruitt cousins, showed up at the Boone Forge on a Saturday morning in April of 1888 with lumber. Other families followed. The roof was reshingled in a day. The east wall was repointed and braced. Someone brought a second anvil that had been sitting in a barn. Someone else brought a set of tongs that had belonged to a grandfather. Mayor Fenwick arranged, through means he was vague about, for a consignment of good Pennsylvania coal to be delivered at the town's expense, on the grounds that Harlan's Crossing needed a working smithy, and the working smithy needed fuel. Mrs. Allgate organized a collection among the families who had not received land, but who understood what had happened and wanted to be part of what was being built, and the collection came to $112, which was enough to cover materials and leave something over. By May of 1888, the Boone Forge, no one called it that anymore. It had begun to be called the Voss Forge, and then simply Nora's, was operational, clean, solid, and busy. Caleb Pruitt was back at the bellows. The schoolhouse needed new hardware for a planned addition. The church needed a bell mount. 2 of the restored homestead families needed fencing, which meant posts and staples and hinges in quantity. Nora worked. She worked in the way she had always worked, which is to say with her whole self, with the particular focus that her father had modeled and that she had made her own, with the warmth of the hearth at her back and the sound of the hammer finding its rhythm and the smell of hot iron in the air, which is not a beautiful smell exactly, but is an honest one, and Nora Tice Voss had always valued honesty above beauty, though she had found that they were often, in the end, the same thing. She kept Aldous Boone's letter. She framed it, eventually, not immediately, but after some months, when she had thought about it enough to know what she wanted to do with it. She hung it on the wall of the forge near the chimney where it had waited, so that the letter and the place where it had been hidden were together in the same room, and so that anyone who came to the forge and cared to read it could understand something about the nature of patience and the nature of guilt and the nature of what it means to do a wrong thing and spend 14 years knowing it, and finally, even in death, finding a way to let the truth go somewhere it could do some good. She thought about Aldous Boone sometimes while she worked, not with the softness of nostalgia, but with the more complex feeling you have for someone whose flaw you understand and whose final honesty you respect. He had been afraid. She understood being afraid. She had been afraid, too, from the moment Garrett's lawyer laid the first document on the table in her kitchen until the moment Hardcastle said the word valid. Fear is not the opposite of integrity. What you do with the fear is what matters, and Boone had ultimately done the right thing, slowly and imperfectly, and from behind the shield of his own death, but he had done it. She thought that her father would have had something to say about this, something about the metal not being lost just because it had gone cold, something about the fire already being there, inside the thing, waiting for someone to know how to call it out. We have told you the story of Nora Voss, and we want to tell you what we know it to mean. We opened by saying she was 37, alone, with $4.60, and we said that everyone who watched her push open that rusted door shook their head. That part was true. It is still true, in the sense that the people who shook their heads were not wrong about what they saw. A cold forge, a broken roof, a widow with nothing to her name starting over in a place that had already taken something from her. What they were wrong about was what cold means, and what nothing means, and what nothing to her name means when the name in question is Noravas. She had her hands. She had her father's teaching in them, the knowledge of heat and color and timing and the particular patience of someone who has learned that iron gives when you ask it right, and that the asking is more important than the forcing. She had $4.60 and a dead forge on the edge of a town that needed her, and inside that forge, inside the cold throat of the flue where a frightened man had sealed his last act of courage, something was waiting that was bigger than her and bigger than him and bigger than the wrong that had been done. Something that belonged to 11 families and a valley and a legal record that had been made false and needed to be made true again. She bought the forge for pennies. Everything else she earned. And the letter that changed a valley cost her nothing at all, except the willingness to look up into the dark and reach for what she could not yet see. If you have stayed with us this long, we are grateful for your company. This kind of story matters to us. The story of the person who is overlooked, who is handed the thing no one wants, who finds inside it the thing everyone needed. If you know someone who could use this story today, please share it with them. We ask you to leave us one thought in the comments. What is something you have found, an object, a place, a moment, that others had written off completely, but that turned out to hold something worth keeping? We would love to hear it. Until next time, stay close.